This is Still Unanswered. I'm Mara Ellison. Tonight, we go back to San Francisco 1974 and 1975, when the city was already raw from a string of headline-making crimes, and a different kind of terror crept through the bars and parks where gay men had only recently begun to breathe a little easier. This is the story of the Doodler, the man who sketched his victims before he killed them. It starts with a phone call in the small hours. January 27, 1974. An anonymous caller tells police there might be a dead body at Ocean Beach near Ulloa Street. Officers find a man face up on the sand, fully clothed, a fierce pattern of stab wounds in his torso and back. He's almost washed out to sea. Later, he's identified as Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, 49 years old, a factory worker and an immigrant who came to San Francisco for work. That night was the first thing we now link to the Doodler. But this is not just a story about wounds or a killer's method. It's a story about how a culture, its laws, its prejudices, its fear, shaped what could and could not be done to hold one person accountable. It's about why some deaths are loudly prosecuted in the press and courtrooms, and why others are cataloged, then quietly forgotten. Who speaks for the dead when the living are afraid to speak up? To help unpack this, I'm joined by Dr. Luis Andrade. Luis is a criminologist and LGBTQ+ historian here in San Francisco. He spent years tracing the history of anti-gay violence and how policing and community dynamics intersected from the 1960s onward. Luis, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Mara. This case has hovered in the background of queer history here for decades. It touches so many of the things I study: the emergence of gay public spaces, the fear of outing, and the ways policing both failed and had the potential to do better.
Luis, before we get into the bodies and the forensics, I want to set the stage for listeners who weren't alive in the city in the mid-70s. Paint that picture for us. What was San Francisco like then?
San Francisco in the 1970s was paradoxical in many ways. On one hand, there was a burgeoning queer public life: clubs, bars, neighborhoods like the Castro and, for some, Tenderloin spots, places where people could meet. On the other hand, the city was in a period of violent crime: Zodiac, zebra killings, the Golden Dragon. There was a sense of a city under siege. Add to that the legal and social context. Sodomy laws still existed in practice. Homosexuality could ruin your job, your housing, your family ties. And you have a setting where gay men could celebrate small freedoms but still lived with enormous risks. Police-community relations mattered too. Many LGBTQ people considered the SFPD hostile. Arrests for lewd conduct were common. Raids on bars not unheard of. Going to the police was not a neutral act. It could escalate the danger to someone's livelihood and reputation. So when violence happened, people often weighed the risk of being helped against the risk of being exposed.
And that fear of exposure, of being outed, is one of the through lines of this episode. The Doodler targeted men in bars. He would sketch them, literally draw them on napkins or a small pad, and use that as an icebreaker. Then he'd offer to go somewhere more private: parks, beaches, Spreckles Lake, Ocean Beach, Lincoln Park, places by the water where the city meets the dark. Once they were alone, knife.
Right. The sketches served several functions. They were flattering. The subject feels seen. They suggested a harmless, shy artist. That disarming charm made people lower their guard. And, where the attacks happened, out of sight of other people, left little chance of immediate help. He attacked with a single common weapon, a knife, and the wounds were often excessive, many stab wounds front and back. Investigators described some of the murders as rage killings because of the overkill.
Let's talk about the men, the people who died, and some of their lives, because part of what keeps bugging me is how easy it is to reduce them to case files. I want to make them visible. First, Gerald Kavanaugh, the first known victim. Lewis, what do we know about him?
Gerald, or Jerry, as some records note, was 49, originally from Canada. He worked in a factory. Not much was publicly detailed about his private life in the papers then, but the facts of his body being found face up on Ocean Beach at 1:30 in the morning, with a dozen or more stab wounds and defensive wounds on his hands and arms, tells you someone fought back. That image of a man who tried to defend himself matters. Even the facts have human texture.
The next confirmed victim, Joseph J. Stevens, 27, was a performer, a well-known female impersonator and comedian. He danced and worked the Tenderloin clubs, something that made him known in the nightlife circuit. He was last seen June 24, 1974, and his body was found the next morning near Spreckles Lake. For Jay, being publicly out was part of his livelihood. The contrast between someone whose art was public and the private terror he met is it's hard.
It is, and it highlights something. Gay nightlife wasn't monolithic. Some men were performers, some were service workers, others were transplants, immigrants, sailors, students. Klaus Christmann, Klaus, was 31, from Germany, married with children earlier in his life, had come to San Francisco seeking a fresh start. He was seen at Bojangles on July 6, 1974, and found at Ocean Beach the next morning with around 15 stab wounds and a throat so deeply slashed he was nearly decapitated. That degree of violence is jarring.
Those words still feel like too much. Then we have Frederick Kappen, 32, Navy veteran, a nurse who served in Vietnam. He was found on May 12, 1975, and died from a stab that hit his aorta. The detail that his body was dragged, too humanizing a detail in the worst way, reminds us these were people with histories. And Harold Goldberg, 66, Swedish-American, found in Lincoln Park in June 1975, decomposed, underwear missing. He is the outlier in age, but linked by location and method.
And we should pause to note, the official SFPD list originally recognized 5 confirmed victims. Later, a probable 6th was added after a re-examination of files in 2021-2022. Some estimates have placed the number of victims higher, as many as a dozen, depending on which cases are grouped. But the known cluster already shows a consistent enough pattern to point toward a potentially single perpetrator.
Let's shift to people who survived. There were 3 surviving victims who later described their assailant. Their testimony is critical to the story, but also, tragically, central to why there wasn't a prosecution. Luis, one of the survivors, is often called the diplomat in reporting. What did he say?
The diplomat provided the most detailed description investigators would get. He described a young black man, about 19 to 25 years old at the time, around 6 feet tall, slender, smooth features, someone who could be described as soft-spoken, maybe slightly effeminate. Importantly, he said the man sketched him, the same art approach. From his recollection, police prepared a composite sketch. That sketch included a knit cap. The diplomat survived, but, crucially, would not testify in open court because of fear of the consequences of being identified as a gay man in his professional life.
Listen, I want to be blunt here. In the 1970s, for a diplomat, being publicly out could mean the end of a career, even personal ruin. So the diplomat's silence is not a moral failing, it's a survival strategy. The same goes for the entertainer, the second survivor, who feared for bookings, his reputation, his livelihood. The third survivor left the city and didn't engage with investigators. Without these witnesses willing to testify, prosecutors said they didn't have enough for trial.
Right. From a legal standpoint, the DA looked at the package and said, without eyewitnesses in court, it's circumstantial. They worried about a not guilty verdict that would preclude a later prosecution if stronger evidence appeared. So the case stopped before it started in the courtroom. Detectives kept their suspect files private, they kept interviewing, but they couldn't compel a man to testify to something that would cost him everything in a society that punished him for his identity.
And we must say, that's not just a legal calculation, it's a moral one. We as a society set a system that made it more dangerous for victims to speak than for murderers to remain free. That's the central injustice in this case.
Absolutely. And it's why the Doodler story is as much about systemic failure as it is about a violent person. The police weren't completely absent. Some detectives, like Rotea Guilford and Earl Sanders, tried to push links. Homicide units were stretched. Zodiac, zebra killings, there were multiple pressures. But the social forces that prevented witness cooperation were decisive.
I want to talk about the suspect the police repeatedly said they questioned. They never named him publicly. Could you summarize what investigators later said about their prime suspect?
Investigators have said they repeatedly interviewed a young black man who matched the diplomat's description. He was questioned multiple times and remained the focus of investigators' suspicions. They said they believed strongly that he was the Doodler, but they lacked that courtroom testimony and a confession. The suspect never confessed, and the DA was unwilling to charge without more. For decades, the suspect's identity stayed internal to files, never publicly released, in part to protect the suspect's legal rights and to preserve the integrity of investigations that might, in theory, resume.
And in recent years, after renewed interest, SFPD released both the original composite and an age-progressed sketch. They also increased a reward to $250,000 around 2022. Louis, do you think modern forensics could change the calculus that prevented charges in the 1970s?
Potentially. There's optimism, cautiously so. The department says they still have physical evidence, including clothing and other items, and they're using modern DNA testing and genetic genealogy where legally permissible. That could yield a profile independent of witness testimony. But evidence preservation is variable. Chain of custody, degradation, contamination, these are real challenges for evidence from the 1970s. Even if DNA is recovered, it doesn't automatically solve everything. You still need to link a person legally to the crimes. But it's a tool that the detectives in the 70s didn't have.
The Chronicle did a long investigation in the late 2010s and early 2020s, and we have to mention that long-form journalism helped put pressure back on the case. Kevin Fagan's podcast and articles brought victim stories back into focus. That public retelling matters because it reframes the narrative. It honors victims as people, not just headlines. Louis, when we talk about public memory, what do you think changed between then and now that makes people more willing to speak?
Many things. Cultural shifts, visibility, legal progress. The normalization of being openly queer, in a way not imaginable in the 70s, mean that being associated with a gay victim is less automatically career-ending for many people. There's also a generational change. People who were quiet then are older, possibly more willing to speak. Families are more willing to acknowledge a relative's sexuality. And technology helps. Podcasts, searchable archives, making stories harder to bury. But there are still barriers. Some survivors may have been traumatized or relocated or died, or still fear consequences in certain professions or countries.
We should pause and acknowledge that at least 3 men survived violent encounters with the same attacker and lived with that memory for decades. We don't know how many more were wounded or threatened and never told anyone. Sometimes I think about the men who left town. How many left and never told a soul because silence was safety?
And that's crucial. The diplomat, for instance, was doing what he had to do to preserve his life and career. Our instinct might be to want justice in courts, but justice can take many forms. Public acknowledgement, memorialization, honest police records, these are also remedies. Still, for families, an arrest would have mattered.
Let's go back to the murders themselves for a moment, because the brutality begs the question of motive. We can't prove motive, but we can talk about theories with care. Lewis, what are some of the main hypotheses?
First, internalized homophobia. The killer operated in gay spaces. The rage suggests some projection of hatred, possibly directed at parts of himself. Second, a punitive motive. He could have seen himself as punishing gay men, but the approach, sketching, flirting, complicates that. It suggests personal engagement, not purely moralistic crusading. Third, sexual dynamics. While clothing was sometimes disarranged, there wasn't consistent evidence of completed sexual assault. The overkill fits more with anger than carefully premeditated sexual sadism in the clinical sense. Finally, racial dynamics. If the suspect was a young black man in predominantly white gay spaces, feelings of marginalization or internal conflict could have played a role, though that's speculative and doesn't excuse violence.
Speculation is dangerous when it assigns motive without evidence, but we do need frameworks to think about how someone might escalate from doodling to killing. The sketches, the doodles, are chilling because art and creation used as a lure. It's a perversion, in a way, that makes it harder to digest.
Yes, and consider the logistics. Choosing secluded outdoor locations, beaches, parks, suggests knowledge of where those spaces would be empty at night. That implies some familiarity with the city and its rhythms. And the absence of robbery, valuables left, points toward the attacker's intent being primarily violent, not theft.
One detail I keep circling back to is the suspect's racial description. Reporting described him as a young black man. That's important because it complicates an already fraught historical narrative about policing and race in San Francisco. Lewis, can you speak to the interplay of race and queerness in this case?
It's complex. For one, black queer men in the 1970s, like black people in general, faced intense policing and social marginalization. If the suspect was black, then our cultural analyses must account for how race and poverty intersect with the way this case was policed and publicized. On the one hand, a black suspect might have attracted harsher police suspicion. On the other, the reluctance of witnesses to publicly name a black man might have been shaped by fears of racialized backlash or the investigator's biases. We can't know precisely, but it's irresponsible to ignore race in the story. At the same time, we must avoid reductive narratives that put entire communities under suspicion based on one alleged perpetrator.
That's a careful line to walk. This case exposes how layered oppression can intersect in a single set of events: homophobia, racism, class. All of it constrains how evidence is gathered, how witnesses behave, and who is presumed credible. I want to take a moment to tell listeners about renewed investigative steps. In 2019, SFPD announced a $100,000 reward and later raised it to $250,000 in 2022. They released an updated age-progressed sketch. They say they still have evidence they're testing with modern techniques.
Yes, the department has said they are using modern DNA and genealogy tools where possible. They recommended people with information come forward. There are procedural and legal safeguards around genealogy privacy debates exist, but these tools broke new ground in cases like the Golden State Killer. They could, theoretically, produce breakthroughs here if suitable DNA is available and matches in databases.
That Golden State Killer point is always in the back of investigators' minds now. Breakthroughs happen, but we must be honest. Evidence can be degraded after decades. Witnesses die, memories fade, and this is practical. Some physical items may have been lost or poorly preserved. Still, the public attention from journalism and the reward have generated more tips than before, and some families got their stories told. That, in itself, is something.
It is. And we should also consider the intangible value of this kind of renewed attention. It changes social memory. When newspapers and podcasts recenter victims' humanity, they reshape how a community remembers those who were lost. That's part of restorative justice, in a way.
Let's give listeners a sense of how the victims' families were affected. Some families were left with no full explanation. Others only learned bits later. Klaus Christmann had a past life, a family he left behind. Frederick Kappen was a veteran. These are lives with threads reaching outward. Other countries, other families. How should we weigh that when we talk about justice now?
Justice has multiple meanings. A criminal conviction is one. But for families, being heard, being recognized, having an accurate public record, perhaps a memorial or a public naming of the victims in an official way, these can all matter. There's also an obligation to confront the structural conditions that made victims feel they couldn't speak. That's policy, training, and cultural work.
That gets to one of our recurring lines on this show. How many cases remain unsolved, not because we lacked clues, but because we lacked compassion? Luis, before we close, I want to ask you, is it possible this case will be solved? And if it is solved now, what would that mean?
Is it possible? Yes, it's possible. DNA and genealogical techniques have solved decades-old cases before. But it's contingent on what evidence survives, on whether it points clearly to a suspect, and on the legal ability to prosecute. If it's solved, it would mean accountability for families, for survivors, and for the community. It would also be a corrective to the era's moral calculus, the way shame and fear protected a killer. But we should also be humble. Even if identified, the legal process might not produce the closure people hope for. Time complicates everything.
If it never is solved, what does the case leave us with? For me, it leaves a record of failures and of lives interrupted. It asks us to look at what we prioritize as a society. Do we protect the vulnerable? Do we make sure victims can seek help without being punished by the system they turn to?
Exactly. And it leaves a responsibility to remember these men in full, not just as entries in a list, but as performers, veterans, immigrants, people who made choices to seek connection, and to use the case as a lesson in how policing and social stigma can obstruct justice, so we do better now.
I want to end with the words we've woven through the episode. Who speaks for the dead when the living are afraid to speak up? The Doodler's name will probably remain a placeholder, an epithet used by newspapers and police. The real man, if he ever is named, would have been a person with a life that led him to those acts. But tonight, we name the men who died: Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, Joseph J. Stevens, Klaus Christman, Frederick Kappen, Harald Gullberg, and the probable sixth, whose name we'll not assign here. If you are listening and you have information, family stories, overheard details, memories, police are still asking for tips. There's a reward. More than that, sharing may be a way of making sure these men are remembered as more than footnotes. Louis, thank you for helping us walk through this carefully.
Thank you, Mara. And thanks to everyone listening for holding this story with the gravity it deserves.
If you want more reading, we'll link in the episode notes to the San Francisco Chronicle's reporting by Kevin Fagan, the CBS coverage, and the other materials that helped shape this episode. Next week, we'll take up another case where silence shaped a prosecutor's choice. Until then, I'm Mara Ellison. This has been Still Unanswered. Who speaks for the dead when the living are afraid to speak up?